This documentary, it's not for the faint of heart. If you're a casual wrestling fan, or you just want to watch a documentary in the same vein as, let's say, The Tiger King, I don't know how this will hit you as you peek into our world of professional wrestling. For me, there isn't really a single new thing that I learned. I knew about the controversies like the Ring Boy scandal, the lawsuit with Rita Charlton, the Jimmy Snuka murder cover-up. I knew about all of this, as would most hardcore wrestling fans. This documentary is something of an anomaly because to the hardcore fans that have been following wrestling for years, this is the first time that we're getting to see such significant figures in the wrestling landscape talk about these controversies, or the first time in a very long time. Growing up, WWE would release these documentaries on the wrestlers and certain significant events, but as time went on and you get older, you see how many of these documentaries felt almost like propaganda and puff pieces. WWE trying to rewrite history and make itself the hero, or at least not paint itself in such a negative light. This documentary was made without the WWE having the final say, and that's important. It's an actual, objective point of view at WWE from a high caliber documentary team that will not yield to the whims of a billionaire. Let me be clear, this is not a hit piece. It's not a gotcha piece. It's a truly objective look at a man who digs his own grave when he is completely without filters. To quote Adam, he's a million grandpas screaming into the ether and never being silenced. And here, it shows. Let's go and strap in, folks. This is going to be a heavy one. Let's start with the beginning of the documentary. Vince had a rough upbringing and was abused. Now, it's odd because in other documentaries and even in the Playboy interview, he does mention physical abuse. The documentary, though, the Netflix one, doesn't mention the fact that he actually stated in that Playboy interview, he stated two things. They're both kind of heavy, guys. The first one was, he wished his stepfather had lived long enough for him to kill him. That's in an interview with a nationally recognized magazine. I wish my stepfather was alive long enough for me to kill him. And somehow it gets darker because he insinuates that there was incest there, that it was from his mom. Which again, it's almost heartbreaking because right when he says that and they allude to that, you see an image or a clip of Vince's mom like with him backstage, and he hugs her and kisses her, and but it explains a little bit of why he is the way he is. And honestly, he probably needs psychological help, but he's too quote unquote manly for that. You just suck up your feelings and you keep going forward. You don't talk about that kind of thing, which is, I honestly wonder what if Vince, who got into therapy, what he would have been like. That same drive and determination, but maybe less of the insanity. Finally, at around the age of 12, Vince met his father. Now, it's also said in the documentary that Vince, he never really asked his dad, hey, why weren't you there during the first 12 years? Vince says, he wasn't expecting his father to, rescue him, but he never discussed it with him. Hey, why weren't you around for the first 12 years of my life? Why weren't you here to save me from this hellhole? Vince had to save himself. So, he can't rely on his father, if that makes sense. But even once Vince Sr. was in the picture, all they really talked about is business. Vince Sr. is, at least from Vince's point of view, not exactly cold, but he treats his son more like a star employee than, an actual son. By Vince's own admission, he never told him that he loved him or that he was proud of him, at least not until he took over the WWE, or in this case, the WWF. Which, if we go back, and again, most of the hardcores know this, Vince's father never wanted him in the wrestling business and didn't want to give him the company. Vince just made him a really good offer, better than Gorilla Monsoon did. But the trade-off was, if he missed any payments, they keep the money and take back the company. Which Vince, by hook or by crook, made it happen, to his credit, I guess. But to do this, he did raid the territory system. It's an old school carnival act kind of thing where, hey, we all have our own spot and we're not going to mess with each other. It was also governed by a national body called the NWA, the National Wrestling Alliance or Association, depending on the version. Vince threw that out the window and started buying up not just territories, but the best wrestling stars from each of the territories to create almost like the first super roster. And from there, he dismantled each company one by one, bit by bit, becoming national. And according to Vince, it's not until this that his father finally tells him for the first time, I'm proud of you. You're beating all of them. Fuck them. And then, the day before he dies, Vince Sr. tells Vince, I love you. The one time that he ever told him that. And it's bleak to hear this old man talk about this because, and again, this is not to excuse what he did. What he did was terrible. But you can almost see for a moment a glimmer of pain in his face when he talks about that. Almost like a child who is sad. It's odd to see Vince almost, not vulnerable, but vulnerable. As the WWF grew, there were all the scandals that this documentary dove into. First one, steroid scandal, which, I mean, there's a very clear evidence in this that although Vince never told his wrestlers to take steroids, at least that's what the U.S. government was hoping for, no. However, and Brett says it best, Vince never told us to take steroids, but if the only guys that are getting pushes are the guys taking steroids, the writing's kind of on the wall. It's everything short of telling us, hey, do this. Which, I mean, yeah, fair enough. He never told his wrestlers to take steroids. He just, kind of not promoted it, but only promoted the people that took it. Look, at worst, he was a drug salesman. At best, he turned a blind eye to a significant problem, and that's not okay. But it's Vince. What do you expect? The two scandals I really did not expect them to dive into was one, the Ring Boy scandal, in which several underage males were sexually abused by certain employees within the WWF at the time. And it's odd because one name that I always heard defended was Pat Patterson, but in this one, Tony Atlas, basically says, he basically not outs Pat Patterson. Pat Patterson was a gay man in wrestling during the time when it wasn't okay. I'm not saying that's right, I'm just saying, that's as an observation. And according to Tony Atlas, Pat Patterson made some uncomfortable advances towards him. And it's odd because this is one of those moments where, this is where the outside world, looks at, this business. The interviewer, stops and asks him, why didn't you tell someone? And Atlas kind of laughs and says, oh, young man, it wasn't like it was now. Back then, who was I going to tell? Vince? He's the booker. That's who Pat Patterson is. I complain, I don't get booked, I don't get paid. Basically outwardly saying, no, you endure the abuse because your payday is on the other side of it. Which is... Wrestling has gotten better, I have to say that. At the very least, shit like that is not happening, and it should have never happened. But again, the fact that they dove into the Ring Boy scandal kind of surprised me. Honestly, the Ring Boy scandal, the Scandals episode could have been a whole thing onto itself. Maybe deep diving in for each one for 15-20 minutes, because there are a number of them. But the Ring Boy scandal, I'm shocked that they dove into this one. That's probably the most unknown of them all. That and or the Jimmy Snuka thing, which if you don't know, Jimmy Snuka, and he was fairly recently found guilty, or they found that he was not mentally fit to stand trial. But supposedly he had, well, not allegedly, but Jimmy Snuka had abused and killed his girlfriend of the time. And it is widely not, this is not fact, this is speculated, that Vince paid the cops so that way Snuka could, get off with murder. And Vince could see a return on his investment because Snuka was in the middle of a hot program with Hulk Hogan, or he was about to start a program with Hulk Hogan. Now, my opinion, this is not a fact, my opinion is in this situation. Do I think Vince paid off the cops? Yes. Can I prove it? No. Why do I think so? Because look at everything else he's done. He has shown that he is willing to cheat. He is willing to resort to barbaric things to win by any means necessary. So what makes you think he wouldn't pay off some cops? Makes sense. Another controversy that they dive into, not as in depth as other things, but shockingly quite a bit, was Owen Hart's death and the controversial decision to continue the show. Now, granted, in the interview, it is, made very clear that the WWF, it was not on them. It was on the company that made the harness. That said, it's still controversial they continued to wrestle. I didn't know this part. I knew that the show continued on after Owen Hart's death. I had never gone to see the show. I wasn't interested. I had no idea that there was blood on the mat after Owen fell. I didn't know that. I didn't know that wrestlers were wrestling right there where he passed. You have no idea. And then they go out of their way to show the promo that Jeff Jarrett is cutting afterwards, where he says, "Owen, I'm praying for you, pal. Now let me tell you about these puppies." Like, to force your performers to continue on when their co-worker at worst or their friend at best, when his blood is there, is just despicable. And people ask Vince, well, what if that was you? And Vince says, well, I would have wanted the show to go on. And then they ask, well, what if it was Shane? Like, that's not okay. And from Vince's point of view, because the audience at home didn't see it, well, we should continue the show, otherwise they wouldn't understand. Which makes no damn sense. Stop the damn show. And then we get probably one of the most interesting parts of the entire documentary, and something that I'm really grateful for the interviewer. So, we're talking about, at this point, how WCW is beating the shit out of the WWF, right? And competing. Now, at one point, Vince says, oh, it's unfair that how they were treating us. They had all these unlimited resources. We're a small mom and pa ran business, right? We're a family-owned business. To which the interviewer actually says, well, wait a second. They're raiding all your talent, the same thing that you did to the territories. And Vince says, no, they were trying to kill us. I wanted to compete with the territories. And the interviewer says, but you did the same thing. You poached their best talent, offered them more money, and they left. How is that different from what Ted Turner did? Like, the interviewer does not let him get away with it. And he stops just short of calling him on his bullshit because, well, they have more interviews to do. They don't want Vince to walk out and fuck off. But the fact that Vince says, well, look, I say whatever is relevant at the time to manipulate the viewer and the audience member, right? If it fits the narrative that I'm the victim in this case, so be it. If it fits the narrative that I am the bad guy in this particular case, well, so be it. I was an opportunist on one side and the victim on the other. And it's insane because it just makes it clear he's an unreliable narrator, and also someone who you should always take anything he ever fucking says with a grain of salt. When you openly admit, I will say what I have to say at the moment, that is not a good thing. That is a hypocrite, an unreliable narrator, and the worst kind of person. Now, we're going to jump forward a little bit in time, right? We're going to jump forward to 2008. Now, around that time, I was a hardcore wrestling fan, right? I remember I bought a DVD called McMahon, right? It was a WWE produced. Remember, they had final say over this particular documentary about 16 years ago. It was a documentary about Vince McMahon and his life and his upbringing and the whole shebang, like creating the WWE. Now, again, Vince had final approval over this documentary. There's a moment where they mention that Steph turned down her father only ever twice. Once was an incest angle where it would be insinuated on national television that Vince was the father of Stephanie's unborn child, who, bear in mind, she was legitimately pregnant with Vince's grandchild at the time, with Triple H's daughter. And in storyline, Vince would have been the dad. Now, here was the other pitch. He also pitched, okay, what about Shane being the father? Just, what the fuck, man? Like, how did, like, this is weird. Like, for being weird. Like, this is not weird for us. Like, this is weird in general. Now, speaking of Shane, this shit gets somehow worse with patricide. It is said multiple times throughout this documentary how Vince was tough on Shane, much tougher than he ever was on Stephanie. Breeding, not necessarily a degree of resentment, but more like a distrustfulness, right? It's jokingly said at one point that Vince would grab Shane's rolls or fat or pull his hair to beat him in wrestling, and Shane would say, "You cheated," and Vince would say, "No, I won." To which, I mean, there's a lesson there as far as like, cheat as long as you don't get caught. Like, there's a lesson there, but you know who else said that? Literally Jose Menendez, and we all know how that turned out. But yeah, there is something to be said about Vince and Shane's relationship being openly hostile. And at one point, Paul Heyman tells this long fucking story about how during a creative meeting, Vince and Shane were really going back and forth. And Shane says, Vince says at one point, over my dead body. Which, tough, but, reasonable or, very clear, hey, it's not happening, right? It's just an acronym. To which he then grabbed a steak knife, put it in Shane's hands and said, "You're going to have to kill me to do what you want to do in this company, like I would have done to my dad if he had stood in my way. And if you can't kill me, then I know you're not tough enough, and I'll need to take that into account too." Which is like, so Vince, you wanted him to murder you in front of a room full of witnesses or what? Just, what the fuck, man? It's weird. It's weird. It's odd to me that Vince wouldn't want better for Shane than what he had. And then we jump forward in time to WrestleMania 32 when Shane and Taker are wrestling. Shane does that insane dive off the Hell in a Cell. And in the back, that's when they hug. And and Shane says, "All I ever wanted was your respect." Which, he had to dive off a 20-foot cage for Vince to love him? Just, again, the worst kind of relationship. Like Shane says, like, those hugs and I'm proud of you are far and few in between. You have to earn that. That's not a good thing. And the good thing that I think I see is that Shane is being a better father to his sons than Vince ever was. Like, you see his kids love him. His kids idolize him. They came out with him during his entrance at WrestleMania 32. Shane, honestly, if there's any good thing about this, you're a good man, and I really hope you continue to succeed. That said, also, we can jump into Bruce Pritchard. During the last episode, there's this moment where Bruce says, "Oh, I hated it. It felt like a gotcha piece, right? That you made Vince look like a piece of shit. You didn't catch his human side." To which they're like, "Okay, what did we miss?" And Bruce talks about how his wife was diagnosed with cancer, and they gave her a 4-year prognosis to live. And Vince saw to it that she had the best medical care available in the world. And she has lived for another 24 years. And Bruce says that because of Vince, my wife is still alive. Which, I mean, how do I say this? Bruce Pritchard has every right to support Vince McMahon because he did something so personal for him as to save his wife's life. That said, Bruce, we all don't owe Vince that kindness. He did a good thing for you. The fact that he sexually assaulted other women, kind of nullifies any of the good that he's done. Right? It's like that Dave Chappelle joke about the superhero that assaults people. At some point, your good actions are outweighed by your bad ones. But yeah, Bruce Pritchard, he's a full-on stooge, which is not surprising at all. Now, there's a point where Vince says, "Oh, me and the Mr. McMahon character are two completely different things." To which literally every single person, from Stephanie to Shane to Paul Heyman to Bruce Pritchard to The Rock to Stone Cold to Mark Calloway, all say the same thing. No, that's Vince just turned up to 11. But that's Vince. The Mr. McMahon character is Vince. So the monster he portrays is, on some level, the monster that he is behind closed doors. And see, that's the weird thing, because as damning as this documentary becomes, most of the people in it are still towing the company line, with the exception of maybe Tony Atlas, Like, they're still like, oh, I'm not going to say anything bad about Vince because, one, either he was a father figure, or two, negative repercussions that may happen. Now, imagine they only exclusively interviewed people who hated Vince. Imagine the shit. Phil Munchnick, who was a reporter from the 90s, a mainstream reporter that really, like, came down on wrestling in the WWF in particular. Like, the dude had, not an axe to grind, but he was not afraid to take on Vince, and Vince hated his guts. Imagine if this documentary had nothing but Phil Munchnick's. Now, that said, I do want to also mention the outsider's perspective that is probably the most interesting thing for me about the documentary, as far as, like, what does the outside world look at wrestling and what do they see? Right? It's like an outsider watching football for the first time, right? And it's kind of interesting to see, like, their perspective, the idea, why do they play the sport. It would be like if I went to Europe and started watching a soccer match, right? Or a football match. You know, it's interesting to see from the outside looking in at these chants that, you know, these 20 or 30,000 fans all know these intricate chants by heart. In America, in American football, they boo, they cheer. I mean, that's about it. Boo or yay and clapping. That's it. Right? Wrestling fans are different, but you get what I'm saying here. It's so interesting to see it from the outside looking in. Going into the last few major points, another thing that's also mentioned is the Chris Benoit discussion about CTE. Vince apparently was very much in denial until Chris Lewinsky, a former wrestler who does research on concussions, Vince said, hey, this guy's really coming at us hard. We should use him and we should talk to him and see what we can learn. Which, I guess, to Vince's credit, question mark, they did ban chair shots to the head and certain maneuvers that were dangerous to the head, which Taker was adamantly against until he realized, well, okay, it is safer. Which, just want to point out here, Taker suffered a concussion at WrestleMania 30, which is one reason why it's largely attributed that his match with Brock Lesnar that night was not very good, because he suffered a concussion. Vince says during the goddamn documentary that he thinks that The Undertaker wasn't concussed. He just doesn't remember that night because of how traumatic it was to lose the streak, which that is the psychopath that we're dealing with here, right? Is a guy who will outwardly argue medical fact because it does not fit his narrative. Now, speaking of which, we're going to get into the dark stuff right now. Fair warning here. The last part of the documentary mentions how they don't discuss Vince, like none of the wrestlers, I don't think were involved in this. They talk about a lot of the sexual abuse allegations leveled against Vince McMahon. Also, it's made clear during the documentary that Vince canceled the last interview because the last interview was scheduled after the allegations came out, after the news stories broke, after the Washington Post broke a lot of these stories as far as like the hush money and whatnot. Vince supposedly paid 4 women $12 million. Then it was brought back the lawsuit that Sable brought up for sexual harassment, which Vince didn't even remember. We have the Rita Charlton thing where in New York, the statute of limitations was lifted for a short period of time where you could sue at anywhere at any time. By that point, Rita Charlton sued Vince and got a payout. Now, there's a moment during this documentary where Vince, denies that he ever assaulted Charlton. Which, okay, like, fair enough. Like, that's what you expect. Hey, you're accused of something. I deny it. Okay, can move forward. The son of a bitch then says, but even if I did, the statute of limitations is up. Like, why? Do you know how guilty that makes you sound? You psychotic old sofa. It's just, the fact that he felt the need to add that makes me think maybe he was guilty. Because innocent people do not proclaim, hey, statute of limitation ran out. It's just, look, I don't have any sources. I'm just some random ass guy on YouTube, but that is shaky in no uncertain terms. They also do mention the 2 biggest ones, which is Ashley Mazzaro, which I wish that dove more into her, but there is a story where she alleges that she was assaulted by a soldier overseas in Iraq, and they never really Vince essentially convinced her to keep it quiet because he didn't want it to impact all the quote-unquote good work that they're doing with the military, which is, again, very problematic. Last but certainly not least is the actual Janelle Grant lawsuit, which they did not go into detail, which kind of shocked me, but they also did not interview Janelle Grant, most likely because it is an ongoing lawsuit that is happening. It just so happens that she paused her lawsuit so that the FBI could investigate Vince for allegations of human trafficking against Ms. Janelle Grant. If I had to bet money, Vince is probably moving his money right now into other people's names. That way she can't get a dime. But either way, the fact is that the lawsuit is happening. Everything is moving forward. Oh yeah, and they also mentioned the tanning bed situation, which I think it was 2006, 2007, where a tanning bed employee alleged that Vince showed off nude pictures of himself and that he tried to grope her, or did grope her. All of this painting this titan of industry in the most monstrous light possible, and somehow it only gets worse because Vince even says there are wilder stories. I am curious, what the fuck went on that was so crazy that Vince would actually say, we have crazier things that happened, we just can't talk about it. I don't know. This documentary series was insightful, interesting, horrifying, and a peek into our world, and not necessarily for the better. What did you think of the McMahon documentary there on Netflix? Was it what you expected? Do you think it'll be the new Tiger King? I don't see it gaining the traction that Tiger King did, but then again, maybe that could take time. That said, we're a new YouTube channel, as you can tell by our low subscriber count, so please do us a favor, like and subscribe. We greatly appreciate it, and yeah, we'll see you all another time. Bye, everyone.